A very warm welcome to all of you joining us today, and yes, we meet on yet another edition of the Spotlight. Now, John F. Kennedy once said children are the world's best resources and its best hope for the future as well. Today I want to start things off a little differently, and my first question is for you and for me. Are we doing our best, not just our best, but our absolute best to protect the children of our country? Are you and I, as responsible citizens and responsible adults as we call ourselves, do we go above and beyond to fulfill our duties and responsibilities to ensure that the rights of a child are honored and respected? Now, keeping these questions in mind, it is our duty and responsibility to fulfill our tasks and responsibilities as individuals, as a group, collectively as a group, as an organization, or even as a country. To talk more about this subject, I have Chiranthi Senanayake, attorney at law, international human rights, and a representative of the Yeheliya Foundation. Thank you for joining me today in the studios.
So thank you for having me.
All right. So it's quite a sad state of affairs, Chiranthi, that we saw this video circulating on social media. And to understand this more, this video came as a way where the father was assaulting a child, right? And for a fact, I know that there are many more cases going on in the country like this, and the reason that this case is quite prevalent was because it came on social media. It's a sad state of affairs, and it's also quite unfortunate, Chiranthi, that this case of child abuse, child assault, where a child is often the victim, it is often a relevant topic. It's a topic that we see continuously on media or news reports coming in. So far, we know that the man has been arrested, the father has been arrested. Those who were aiding the incident, as it goes, correct me if I'm wrong, in legal terms, have also been arrested. The child has also been taken into police custody and produced before the judicial medical officer. What happens after this? Once a person who has committed the crime, what happens to the person who has committed the crime, and what happens to the people who were aiding the incident, and what happens to the child?
Firstly, I would like to start off by saying Ayubowan to everyone, and thank you so much to the ITN network for having me. I would like to thank the network as both an attorney at law and a representative of Yeheliya Foundation, and also just an individual who has been working in the development sector, who has been actually passionately working towards the empowerment of child's rights. The opportunity to talk in platforms like this draws attention to this cause. So let me first contextualize this particular issue of child abuse and child assault, and then go into answering your question. So you are very right in saying this particular issue of child abuse is not something that is perhaps a very recent or contemporary issue. It is something that has been taking place perhaps since the start of human civilization itself. The fact that children have been vulnerable to abuse and assault, and we also see that there has been a spike in the number of child abuse cases in the recent years, because when you look at the statistics and the facts, what you really see is there is an increase in child abuse in the same sort of cycle with crises in countries. So if I'm to give you a couple of facts and statistics just to contextualize things, so perhaps the best metric for us to know the issue of child abuse and the gravity of this issue of child abuse, we can look at the National Child Protection Authority's annual data reports, the reporting that they do. And we see in 2023, there were 2,026 cases reported of purely on the need for care and protection. And then we see around 328 cases of grave sexual assault, 1,833 cases of cruelty. And when you go back 2 years, in 2022, there were 10,500 cases of abuse reported, and it was much higher in 2021, where it was 11,200. So this is not me sort of sprouting out numbers, but just to show you, in a country with close to a 22 million population, these facts and figures actually communicate a very serious problem. And the problem being, in my opinion, that children, very similar to other communities, whom we refer to as at-risk or vulnerable communities, are communities that require special protection, not just by the law, not just by the macro systems, but also by society as a whole, and as by individuals such as you and I as a whole. So because I believe that, and also communicating the thought process of Yeheliya Foundation itself. Communities are such as children, and advocating for communities such as children is actually an individual sort of cause which we tend to sort of pass off to the state structures and the state systems. So having contextualized the problem, now let's get into what happens to this the person who has been arrested, as well as those arrested alongside of him for aiding and abetting. So we see that first what will happen is the initial processes is where the child is taken under what we call interim care of the officers before being produced to the medical officer for examination to see what sort of injury the child has sustained, whether or not the nature of the injury is purely physical, has the child sustained any sort of sexual injury or sort of any injury, and what sort of physical, mental injury has the child really sustained.
So does the child know, if it's a minor, does the child know this is what I'm going for an examination?
So usually what happens is when you really are in the situation, you see children who are below 10 years of age, they cannot process what they're going through. So hence this requires us, this perhaps permits me to highlight an issue of sensitizing the officers who are part of the system itself to ensure that the child doesn't go through a traumatic arrest process itself. Because what if we look at the video and the pictures that sort of came after on social media and on news reports of the child being also taken into care, interim care, what we really see is those who actually took the arrest, not arrest is the wrong word, I apologize, but who took the child under interim care, the child did not even clothe the child in a t-shirt. Like, then this is a young girl, right? So we see that she's topless and she has been taken out of the house in without a top and just in the shorts that she was wearing. So that is an indication of the fact that this particular situation is being treated very similar to, like, let's say a crime that involves intervention in situations of, like, let's say murder, drugs, etc., where there is violence, there is immediate intervention. But issues of assault, rape, etc., requires a more sensitive approach, which I feel has not been adopted in this particular situation, because usually in these cases, when these cases are filed and when they're processed, they sometimes even take 10 years in the court system for a verdict to come. So by that time, this young girl is going to be 14 years. And imagine her reflecting on her life and seeing pictures on cyberspace of her as a child being topless child, being sort of taken into interim sort of care. So that's just purely from a child's perspective. But going to the perspective of the assaulter, or the alleged assaulter, but perhaps in this case it's quite clear considering the fact that there is video evidence. What we really see is the assaulter is going to be remanded and has been remanded and produced before the magistrate court. This is the tourism magistrate court, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, the tourism magistrate court in Padavia. He was produced before that. And then there was a verdict that was given by the magistrate court to one not only sort of hold in remand the alleged assaulter, but also there has been a psychiatric evaluation ordered for the mother as well. For the simple reason that she was essentially a bystander in this particular situation. And I must also note that there is a bit of confusion in terms of the nature of relationship between parties as well. And I would like to speak a little bit about it further perhaps when you're talking about media ethics. But you see a lot of both social media as well as mass media channels highlighted the fact that the person had a affair partner who was also arrested. Then comes the question of what really is the idea that you're trying to give about not only the assaulter but the family situation as a whole. So there was a confusion in terms of the nature of relationships, but it was later clarified to be the biological father. But what we really see is once he's taken into remand and when he goes through the trial process, a court process, and the court process is initiated by the Attorney General's Department, the state, on behalf of the child. And then there will be an evaluation to prove the fact that this man has committed not only cruelty towards the child but also grievous harm of the child or assault of the child. And once it is proven, he is given the appropriate imprisonment and terms of imprisonment.
So now what happens, Chiranthi, we saw in the video that there were a few females also alongside, and I'm very sure that these females could have easily stepped in and done something if they wanted to. But of course, it comes as a fact that they have not committed the crime either. They are not the ones assaulting the child. But they have also been arrested. On what presses are they charged?
Sure. So under the law, there is this concept of bystander. Bystander is where it really is something that is debated upon in terms of the liability of a bystander. But under the law itself, a bystander is an individual who watches or perhaps merely is in the presence of the crime being committed. So they are not held to the same liability, the same legal sort of standard as the committer of the crime itself. But the unique situation here is that we see of the bystanders, there was the mother who actually has a legal responsibility to care for the child, and hence is held accountable on the basis of a relationship to the child. But you don't really see any sort of legal liability being imposed on other bystanders for aiding and abetting, because I think this was they were arrested on the basis of aiding and abetting, but they do not get the same sort of penal action as the assaulter themselves. But one thing I would like to note is that it's very easy for us to sort of sit here and talk about this in the context of the law, thinking of it purely from a black and white perspective. But we also need to understand, because certain sort of information from the case that's coming in says that this particular assaulter has actually assaulted the child previously, but the people who were around him did not actually speak up about it to the police.
It has been a continuous scenario.
Precisely. And one of the reasons, so when the ladies were questioned as to why they did not report about this earlier, and why perhaps even the person who was recording didn't report about this earlier, they said that they were afraid of this man, and that there was an element of them also being harmed by this man. So we need to sort of take into account the socio-economic context within which this happened as well, because child abuse is actually, in my opinion, a reflection of a socio-economic reality of a country at a given point of time. Because it's you see, when there is an economic crisis in a country, child abuse cases rise. During COVID, we saw a rise in child abuse cases, because it's a reflection of the mentality of the parents, the financial situation of the parents as well. So considering all of that, I feel like a more nuanced conversation has to happen if we are to speak about it in a more humane ground.
Now, we've also mentioned, and you also rightly mentioned, when cases like this happened, in a general format, we see a huge delay for the proceedings, for the follow-ups. Now, we see the penal code coming in. We also see the Children and Young Persons Ordinance. The Prevention of the Domestic Violence Act 2005, the National Child Protection Authority Act in 1998, international conventions coming in. So many of these laws and acts have been put into place for the purpose of protecting a child from such acts. If our laws and acts are so strong, Chiranthi, why is there such a delay in our system?
Sure, that perhaps is the golden question in my opinion, because if we are to look at Sri Lanka's perhaps legal history itself, especially post-independence legal history, we really see that Sri Lanka actually has a history of two things. The first thing is what we call over policy making. What we mean by that is the country has a history of merely producing policies and adopting policies without mainstreaming policies. That has always been the nature of Sri Lanka's policy making, and I feel that I can openly speak about this and acknowledge it. And the second reality is Sri Lanka also has a history of overcommitment to international conventions and legislations. What I mean by overcommitment is we have the tendency to ratify a convention or an international sort of statute or perhaps agreement when it comes out, but we rarely integrate it into our national law. A good example being, we have actually signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but we do not actually have constitutional as well as other sort of guarantees of this rights of the child actually being protected. So that is just one example. So what we really see is those two are the main reasons as to why we don't actually see effective implementation of laws. It's not the case that we don't have the framework, it's the case that it's not being mainstreamed and integrated. And another issue that we face when we go to train police officers or perhaps work together with the legal system is that those who actually work at a grassroots level, those who engage with the community, don't have the necessary sufficient legal knowledge of the laws that are in place as well. So we also see an issue of like knowledge dissemination. And one final point that I wanted to actually make is we also see that Sri Lanka's laws are it's basically a cocktail of different laws. So we have colonial laws, we have personal laws, then we have laws that have been adopted by Sri Lanka once it became independent nation, a so-called independent nation in 1948. But we see that these laws, they are not streamlined, so we have paradoxical sort of adoptions. Now, for example, in May 2024, we saw the cabinet approved the banning of corporal punishment, and there are going to be amendments that are going to come to both the penal code as well as the other laws, right? So what we really see is what we see through this approval that the cabinet ministry has given is they are going to ban corporal punishment, but we also see Article 82 of the penal code currently saying that if a parent conducts an act in so-called good faith, it does, it cannot be constituted a crime.
So how do we know what is this so-called good faith?
Yes, that is the difficult question, isn't it? Because if we are to look at Article 8 provisions, let me actually read it quickly out to you. Yeah. Nothing which is done in good faith for the benefit of a person under 12 years of age or of unsound mind, etc., etc., is an offence by reason of any harm which it may cause. So we see that then what happens is when you have such a problematic provision in the penal code, then the entire sort of stress falls upon the judiciary to interpret this section. Right. And what happens is then it's sort of like a passing of responsibility to the judiciary, and then it becomes a very circumstantial thing to determine what is good faith. And often if there is a standardization of the interpretation and capacities for interpretation in terms of the judiciary, then we can rely on it. But however, in cases that are this sensitive, we do need more solidified and streamlined systems and processes. So that is another sort of shortcoming in the system that we need to address.
Yeah. So now, Chiranthi, once a child is taken in, yes, most often or so the child is sent into probationary care and child care services. Absolutely. I just want to go back in time, not so long ago, just to December 2023. Yes. We also reported it as well because it came in most of news reports that there was a warden arrested over the death of yet another child in Kalmani, and the child was assaulted, and the child unfortunately passed away, and we lost the life of that child. Now, the rightful inheritance of every child, Chiranthi, the child should be in a home where the child is loved.
Absolutely.
Right? A child is sent to a probation home hoping that this child will be looked after. When such incidents happen, where the probation officers or wardens, as we call them, act in this format, it leads to a very negative example in the system. It leaves a bad impression on the system. So this story leads to a question: are children, when they are sent into probation homes or probation centers, are they safe?
That is actually a question that's difficult to answer in one word. I cannot say yes or no, but I perhaps would like to reflect a little bit on the dimensions of the issue at hand. So firstly, I would also like to say that Sri Lanka, despite all these shortcomings, there is an apparent commitment in terms of the protection of right to children, because I feel that the overall reflection on the fact that Sri Lanka is underperforming in terms of its child rights is also not fair, because we are one of the few countries in the world that does provide universal access to primary and secondary education. With all its shortcomings, we do have a public healthcare system, and I feel like we need to appreciate this because we tend to focus a lot on the negativities of it. However, saying that, I would also like to say that Sri Lanka's probationary care system is unfortunately very much underfunded. There is a lack of policies to sort of govern this probationary system, and we also see an issue with infrastructure. So if I am to sort of explain what I mean by that, so one of the big problems of Sri Lanka's probationary system is they adopt what is called minimal provision principle, as in, if we can feed the child, if we can give a roof above the head of the child, if we are able to sort of send the child to the main school system, that is what is childcare. That's sort of the minimal basic service provision principle is what operates in this probationary system. And one of the main reasons why that is because the probationary system doesn't receive enough funding from the state structure to provide anything more than that. But this is not just a Sri Lankan problem. If you take a look at the foster care system, even abroad, or the probationary care system in other countries, they also have the problem, the same issue. Because under the law, we see that the state is the main guardian of the child, but after that there is a delegation of power to the parents itself. So when the parents are not able to perform, the responsibility goes back to the state. And when you're dealing with a state that has its own financial and macro crises, then you see that children within the state system do get neglected, and they do suffer abuse, they do experience different forms of assault themselves. And one other issue that I would like to highlight is Sri Lanka's adoption system is very weak because of the fact that we don't have a pro-adoption sort of process in Sri Lanka which incentivizes adoption. So even when a parent is interested in adopting children, they need to go through so many levels of bureaucracy and paperwork that often discourages parents who want to take these children in from taking them in. And therefore we see a situation that until they're 18 years, they just survive in the probationary system itself. It's just a matter of keeping them alive until they're 18, and then on the basis that they're adults, they're functioning adults, letting the children out into society.
Welcome back to the show this evening. We're in conversation with Chiranthi Senanayake on the topic of child rights in Sri Lanka. We were in the course of conversation regarding probation care, probation homes and children, which means most of their formative years, which are also pivotal, plays a huge role. Most people think once you're 18 you are set, but actually when a child is between 4 to 18, those are the important years of their life. And most often also, these children in these homes have undergone severe child abuse.
Absolutely.
So my question for you, Chiranthi, is these children also need education, as normal as it seems. Are these children sent into normal schools, or are there special schools for them?
Absolutely. So if I am to answer that question, I think it depends on the circumstances of the child, and it also depends on the resources that are available at a local governance level. What I mean by that is the precedent that's generally followed in the system is to send the child to the main school system, the normal school system itself. So it could be the state school system, it's generally the state school system, but in rare cases where the child is receiving, let's say, external donor funding, then you can choose a child and sort of sponsor their education into, let's say, the private school education system, but that's a very rare occurrence. Now, speaking about the children going into the normal school education system, the main reasoning for that is the system believes that when you send the child alongside children from other families through the schooling process, there is what is called a socialization that happens, where children essentially go into society and sort of mingle with society and gain social skills. But the thing is, this is an assumption itself, purely because like you mentioned, the child comes from a point of having a traumatic past. So therefore they often tend to act out in schools. They're often the ones that are banned as the naughty children in school. They experience corporal punishment in school itself, even though there was a circular sent in 2016, and even though the Supreme Court in 2021 also banned or verdicted against corporal punishment, we still see it happening in schools. So we often see that it's just these children who are coming from the probationary system that are also persecuted in a more social way within the school system as well. So we see that there isn't any sort of support given to them to actually socialize, apart from them being dumped into the school system itself. And then in other circumstances where, let's say, you're dealing with a child with special needs or a child who is a juvenile delinquent who's also in the probationary system, then based on the unique needs of the child, there is a possibility to provide them with special education. But then again, it also depends on the circumstances and the resources. But you really see that children who come from the probationary care system, they're extremely talented. They're kids who have big dreams about what they want to do in life, but they find it difficult to deal with the transition because we don't have, let's say, in-house counseling being appropriately provided within the probationary care system. We don't have children being provided with special training skill sets that you naturally acquire if you were coming from what I would like to call a functional home, because there are no perfect homes. So you see this situation of children finding it difficult to adjust, but they do go through the general school system itself.
Now, Chiranthi, there is another aspect that we see. I would just like to clear it out. We see children who commit, some sort of, I can't say crimes, but minor crimes, if you were to say it. These children, are they also put into the same probation houses, or are they kept separately?
Well,
all the children who suffer from child abuse, are these the minors who commit minor offences?
Yes, minor offences.
That's the word. Are they put together, or is that a completely different set?
Well, the ideal situation is, and this is actually required by the existing policies, that children who are juvenile delinquents who have been committed of conducting minor offences, as you say, are to be given special probationary care separate from children who come from, let's say, abusive homes.
Right, so it's two different.
Yes, by policy, yes, but practically what happens is, because probationary homes are so rare and few, the children actually stay together. So when we conduct these trainings for kids, I mean, very recently I was part of a training that was conducted by a leading sort of Colombo institution. I'm not at liberty to say the name of it because I don't have permission. But I was doing a drama workshop for around 30 kids who are from the probationary care system. So you had children who actually came from abusive homes, and you also had children who were convicted, that is the word, of minor offences. So you really see that there is actually intermingling. There is a positive and a negative of it. In those circumstances, it really becomes a question of what is the more powerful force. If by any chance the more influensive force is the element of minor offences, then you see children coming from abusive families being drawn into the idea of the fact that it might be okay to commit these offences. But on the other hand, you also see that that level of socialization helps children who are juvenile delinquents, because we need to understand that children who are juvenile delinquents are labelled as being unsavable. That's the word that is often used in Sinhala. Megolanga bera ganna ba is what often these officers say. But when they interact with children who are not juvenile delinquents but who also come from abusive homes, then there is an element of socialization that happens positively as well. So there are both sides to the story, which I think should be highlighted.
Now, moving on to so much to talk about, I'm trying to squeeze in as many questions. We spoke about this briefly on our conversation off as well. This fine line between discipline and punishment, corporal punishment, as you as a legal experts would call it. Within the Sri Lankan culture, we see many families come to a point of disciplining a child. You do something, sometimes a mother might give a bit of a knock, right? So that is what we see commonly. So parents might ask a question saying, how do I discipline my child? If I hit my child as a method of discipline, will I be arrested? Right? So how do we navigate through that?
Yes, absolutely. So that, I think, is a very important question, and a question that has been asked in this debate regarding corporal punishment. So if you look at the advocacy sector on banning corporal punishment against children, you have those who completely believe that children should not be physically punished for any wrongdoing, and then you have those on the other end of the spectrum who argue that disciplining is necessary. It may involve some sort of physical contact, however it should not go to the extent of assault and grievous harm. So I would like to sort of take both these schools of thought into account when I'm giving my sort of answer. So I think the best way for us to separate what is punishment and what is discipline is purely based on the intention of harm that the parent was aiming to commit. So I would like to sort of avoid giving my personal opinion on whether children should be punished by sort of giving them a whack or not, because I feel that everyone has their own personal perspectives on that matter. But I would say, according to the law, you are liable for committing corporal punishment against your child if your intention is to harm, and if your punishment is so severely disproportionate to what the child has done. So in this particular video, we saw that the child has merely eaten some sugar, and she's being hit by the father because she has not asked for permission when eating sugar. So then it's pretty apparent that being assaulted that way is not a proportionate punishment. So intention is the biggest factor, and the second factor is how proportionate is the action that you are taking. But on But we see that as a precedent now, the law is discouraging corporal punishment. The law is saying you cannot hit your kid when you are even within the settings of a house. Before, it used to be corporal punishment was originally banned in institutions like prisons. Then later we saw the law saying, look, corporal punishment is banned in schools. And now we see from May this year, corporal punishment is in the next couple of months going to go down. Banning of corporal punishment is going to filter down into the house. So purely from a legal perspective, our standpoint is that children should not be beaten in the name of disciplining. However, we see that when it comes to being a parent, we need to acknowledge this also, Mariela. I feel like being a parent is not easy, and we often don't talk about the psychology of being a parent, the fact that it is difficult. You are responsible for a life, and you yourself sometimes feel so overwhelmed that you are under so much financial stress, psychological stress, that sometimes you do make mistakes, and that is also part of being a parent.
There's always two sides to a coin.
To a coin.
So, Chiranthi, I'm moving into an area which is related to my area of expertise, and that is media, right? As we all know, Sri Lankan media tends to get a little volatile.
Absolutely.
Right? For the sake of ratings and promoting, your company's brand, in general, most organizations would go to the extent of broadcasting and revealing the identity of a child. You were mentioning the child was also exposed without a top, so on and so forth. This is not a good example that we set, right? We also saw, just taking into account, we saw the family, Sri Lankan family, which was murdered in Canada. We saw contrasting reporting where foreign media did not show the suspect, the family was not showed, crime scenes were not showed, but Sri Lankan media, we failed the system. So I think it's imperative that we address this issue. Media has the power to change minds, to influence minds. It is a very powerful tool for any country. And I think it has to be used in a very positive note. I would like your thoughts on this when it comes to ethical media reporting.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest problems, in my opinion, with Sri Lanka's culture of media reporting is as you very correctly mentioned, there is sensationalization of an issue. We take an issue, we sensationalize it for the mere reason that we want to be the first to report it, or we want to be the first to report it big. That's often the approach that is taken. And I know that I can comfortably be critical about this, but it's a different case when you are in the media system itself. But purely as an outsider, we really see that if you look at this particular issue, the first thing is the moment it happened, we saw that even without verifying facts and figures, media outlets actually reported on this issue, both print media as well as television media. We saw, like, for example, when I was reading around 4 or 5 articles reported on this issue that on different forms of newspapers, and we see one newspaper said 5 people were arrested, others said 3 people were arrested. Then there was also this issue of like whether or not what really is the relationship between the child and the assaulter. Then there was this entire debate on the fact that the assaulter actually had an affair partner, and the affair partner was also arrested. Then comes the question, why is it so necessary for you to highlight the fact that the person had an affair partner? And how does it play into this particular case at hand? What sort of narrative are you trying to really give through such sort of signaling and messaging? So I feel like in this particular case, in addition to the basic media ethics of not exposing the child and not exposing even the assaulter before, because under the law you do have this principle that you are innocent until you're proven guilty before a court system. But we see that often what happens is, in sensitive issues of women, involving women, children and young boys, the media has already branded the accused and has already branded the child purely by exposing them to the entire society. I mean, we could also perhaps draw the link and say the moment the video was released into social media and the moment it became such a sensationalization, the assault actually fled. I mean, that would have been a contributory factor, because the next logical thinking on the part of the assaulter is someone's going to come and
run away.
To run away, yes. So even possible conversation. Now imagine if it is the case that the assaulter, it has not been proven yet, but if we are to understand that the assault had some sort of psychological condition, or let's say the assaulter was under some sort of duress, financial, yes, whatever it is, yes. We see that we can't even enter into a conversation of rehabilitating this assaulter because he's already branded by the media as well as society as being someone, again, unsavable. This is me not defending his actions, but purely to highlight the fact that there is absolute responsibility on the part of whoever is letting out the information to be responsible in the way they let out the information. And often in these cases there isn't fact checking that goes into place, and we also see that most local reporters have close contacts with the police officers, and then they use that to get special information or sensitive information, confidential information, and it's leaked out into society through media reporting. So media ethics plays a massive part in terms of maintaining confidentiality and the right to even, universally now there is a right to anonymity where you can actually choose. Now the European Union recently passed a legislation which said that you can choose to remain anonymous on the internet, like you can choose for your pictures etc. to be taken down. But this particular child who's only 4 years, she does not have that choice because it's already been exposed into the cyber world, and the cyber world is often very permanent in its sort of branding.
And the fact that she's only 4 years old and she probably does not even have any idea that she has been sensationalized.
Absolutely.
So since we are talking all about media ethics, I would like you to address, or sort of, I can't say advise per se, but how would you sort of address this issue, and how would you guide or tell journalists how do we strike that balance between reporting on an issue and also respecting the dignity and privacy of an individual or a child in this case?
Absolutely. So when you are reporting an issue of this nature, the first principle that we need to sort of adhere to is the principle of confidentiality. It's absolutely important because when you are dealing with vulnerable populations like women, children, young boys, even persons with disabilities who often face quite a bit of stigmatization in social settings, it's necessary for you to ask yourself, do I have to reveal the identity of this person for the story to have the impact that it's which I intend for it to have? Because often the same incident could have been reported using graphics or using some sort of using some sort of reporting technique that doesn't identify the victim nor the assaulter. Now we see a lot of television channels using drawings etc., or perhaps using animations. So was it really necessary for us to actually reveal the identity of the child? So that is the first question we need to ask ourselves. How necessary is it for me to reveal the identity to have the impact that I'm intending to have? And I think the second principle that we need to adhere to is to ensure that there is also what we call the confidentiality not only of identity but also of information, because I really feel if you have to go back to the idea that this person actually had an affair partner, that is unnecessary information that doesn't contribute to the case at hand, because the only reason why the media should report this is to actually highlight the fact that this is taking place and this needs to be stopped. And one more thing that I would like to say is, more than as equal to the impact of mass media on sensationalization, we also have the impact of social media, because I really feel that now a lot of information is being revealed on social media without ethics even before the mass media channels could even get to it.
True.
So I feel that
I think even before television channels, before any channel report the issue, it went viral on social media. And which is why the police were informed about it through social media.
Exactly. So then comes the question of, in addition to media ethics, how is it that you use social media responsibly? How is it that you follow ethics of confidentiality of identity, confidentiality of information, even as individuals? So this requires both institutional advocacy and individual advocacy as well. And one final point that I would like to mention is, where the law can step in terms of streamlining media ethics is to ensure that there is an act that is passed that actually requires media organizations to be responsible in terms of media reporting. But unfortunately in Sri Lanka we do not have that level of legislation that has come into place. You have basically management related policies and laws that media institutions have to follow, but in terms of ethics itself, we need to sort of legitimize ethics, in my opinion.
Now I just want to, time is catching up, but I just want to squeeze in another question.
Yes, please.
For failing to report a suspected case of child abuse, can individuals or organizations be legally be held responsible?
Yes. So it depends on the nature of responsibility that's actually placed upon them, because if you take a look at an institution like, let's say, the National Child Protection Authority, there was actually an Auditor General's report that was released in 2018 of the effectivity of the National Child Protection Authority. And what we really see is that the National Child Protection Authority was accused of being ineffective in the way that they actually dealt with complaints, right? So if you are, let's say, looking at the NCPA as an example, if they do not actually perform that job role of investigating into complaints that have been received, forwarding complaints to the state sector to actually start the trialing process, then yes, they can be held responsible on the basis that they have the mandate. But in terms of individuals, also the responsibility changes based on what sort of position you hold. Like, let's say you are a Gram Niladhari officer, or you are, let's say, the Women and Child Affairs officer in the Provincial Council. And if you, for example, because of biasness or because of sort of personal relationships you have to the family, if you decide not to report the case, then you also are held responsible. But let's say you are a person who's in that particular situation, and we need to understand most often than not, in a house setting, in an individual setting, people don't go forward with reporting because they either want to hold the family together, they're afraid of losing the child, or they're afraid of, there is some sort of fear that keeps them. In such a situation, the law doesn't criminalize them,
right,
but the law does say if there is an issue, report it, help us preserve our children.
Which leads me into my final question, if we could briefly touch upon it, which I think is important. On a personal level, there are many hotlines that have been established. If you know of a case of a child being abused, please call this hotline. We see number of hotlines, in existence. On a personal level, I did a little bit of research, and I did try calling each of these hotlines which have been put into place on a personal level. And unfortunately, no one picked up the hotline. Right? I'm not going to be naming any of the establishments or institutions, but these hotlines have been put into place for the purpose of child abuse. If you know of a child getting abused, to call and report. Let's say a child is getting abused, the child knows the number, no one answers the phone. What do we do in such an instance?
In such an instance.
Chiranthi?
So we need to acknowledge the fact that the institutions that have been put in place to actually deal with child complaints, I can perhaps say it because of my position, we know that the National Child Protection Authority is the leading institution that's responsible for this. There have been many complaints that have been alleged against the NCPA, saying that they don't answer the hotline, like they actually don't respond to phone calls. So we need to also look at it in the sense that the NCPA has in many circumstances responded saying that they, one, have a problem with resource allocation, they have a problem with funding, and they also have a situation of understaffing which they deal with. But leaving that aside, they do have a responsibility to answer their phones. But in a situation where you cannot reach these hotlines, the first point of contact should be your local police authority. So where you cannot reach out to these hotlines, contact your local police authority, and if there is no help there, go to your Gram Niladhari officer. There is a women and children's officer in every police station, contact that person, and failing which, speak to the women and child affairs officers in the provincial council or provincial council itself. So those are the options that are available to you.
Because as we know, most of these cases, we don't see all of these abuse cases go behind doors at houses. Not everyone will be videoing you and releasing it on social media. Even the reason that this case came out was because one person had, I think, the presence of mind to video it, and that way we are still having this conversation. And like I said at the start of, it is a sad state of affairs that this topic never goes out of trend. It's a topic that we talk every single day. So on that note, I want to thank you for joining me today and for being here in the studio. As I said, it is a topic of prevalence, and I'm hoping that we see a positive change in the near future and justice prevails.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so I was in conversation with Chiranthi Senanayake, attorney at law for international human rights and a representative of the Yeheliya Foundation. That brings us to the end of yet another edition. Join me again next time, same place, for a story that will ignite change. Until we meet again, stay safe and have a pleasant night.